Good evening and welcome to another edition of Pastor's Talk tonight. My name is Bobby Wood, teaching pastor here. We've got Daniel Savage, Tim Lewis, and we have Nick Erickson here tonight. And we're going to, as our Ask Anything question and answer show. So if you have specific questions that you want to ask us, you can ask us anything and everything. We try to tackle things related to theology, questions about God, questions about even current events. And so we thought we'd kind of jump into tonight by kind of talking a little bit about some current events that have been going on in our culture that have been, I think, very prevalent in the news. And how do we respond as Christians as a result of some of these things? So as we start talking about this, though, I just want to remind you, if you have questions, to text them to redemption at 94,000. Redemption at 94,000. You can also comment on the Facebook Live. We'll try to catch them there as we have time and ability. And then if we don't get to your question tonight, we can always answer it next time. So kind of to start us off tonight, our nation is in upheaval right now.
Right.
Pretty much, I think, every major city in America, we are seeing protests happen. We're watching some of those protests become maybe a little bit more violent. Some of them are very peaceful, and not a whole lot of other things are happening there other than just standing up for what has happened. Mm-hmm. We also know that these protests were initiated when a man named George Floyd was killed by a police officer who had a knee on his neck, and it brought up, I think, a lot of maybe underlying racial tension that was in our country to the surface and brought it to a boiling point. That's fair to say.
That's it.
And so I thought tonight, kind of wanted to address this issue, and there's so many things going on with this issue. I mean, there's the protests, and we see looters, and we see people who are attacking police officers. At the same time, what should our response be when we see something like this, where basically you see a man get killed on video, and something terrible, as tragic as that? How do we respond to things like this? And I think there's a lot of people asking these kinds of questions, and I just kind of want to tackle it from a Christian perspective. How do we, as the salt and light of Jesus, right, and sharing the message of the gospel, how do we interact with things like this in culture? So let's talk a little bit about that tonight. So just kind of thoughts, maybe just general thoughts as we get started.
I feel like this is a safe starting point. So when this happened, our kids are hearing this, and my wife, and we're sitting down at dinner and trying to wrap my head around what are takeaways for them and myself. And one of the things I was trying to impress upon my children, and there's a lot of caveats to this, but I was trying to remind them that we cannot afford to be people that run away from hard things, but to be a part of when something that you see is happening wrong, you have to be engaged in trying to correct that wrong. Specifically, if you're there. Let's use school for them as an example. If someone's mistreating someone, be a part of helping solve that solution. Now, I'm not telling them to use physical force or non-physical force. I'm not giving them any specifics, but my prayer for myself is that I'm never seen as running from a hard thing, but trying to figure out how God can use me to embrace it. And so my family kind of talked through that one too, is like when we're seeing something like this happen, what should our response in that moment be? And so I think trying to impress upon my kids, like, no, you have to be a part of the change. You can't just watch it. Don't be the person, and I'm not picking on anyone who's videoing. That can't be you. You've got to be engaged in trying to correct whatever wrong you're seeing in the means that are appropriate, biblically, morally, legally. I want them to carry that perspective as well. But so anyway, that was just kind of where we started our conversation as a family on just how do they see this when they see wrong in front of them, because they're going to experience much more than maybe even sometimes we've experienced in our lifetime. So anyway.
Well, let's get into the issue itself. Let's start there, talking about the actual issue. I would say, as far as I can tell, I don't see really any way that you can spin what happened to George Floyd as a good thing.
Right.
I think is clearly wrong. Is there agreement there on that?
Complete.
Would you guys say that?
Yeah.
So when you look at an issue as tragic as that, I mean, it's tragic. I mean, it's terrible. I was reading an article. There's been lots of articles on this stuff this week, but it was talking about that. It was a police officer he was sharing. He said, these kinds of things, we, the good police officers, we hate more than anybody else.
For sure.
And I thought, that's really interesting. So as far as like that sense, right? Let's talk about the morality of this incident here.
Yeah, I think I've not seen anybody on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, I'm sure there are some. Personally, I've not seen anybody go, oh, that wasn't a big deal. That guy deserved what he got coming to him, whatever, which is what we have sometimes heard, especially if it's more of an unknown. It seems like you said, it's almost unanimous that what happened on the video was wrong. It was murder. It should not have happened, and we should all be completely disgusted by it. And so I think in our day and age, it's difficult because although social media, everyone with a camera, video camera in their pocket, can be a good thing. And in this case, it was a good thing only in that we had direct video evidence of what actually happened. It can also be a bad thing because there are many in our culture who they're wanting to be on the right side of history, whatever that means, but sometimes they do it in such a way that they're not even thinking about the problem, and they're not even listening to what's actually happening. I mean, we've seen riots. I mean, I remember when I was a kid, the riots in LA, over, I think it was Rodney King, the Rodney King beating. Like, I can remember that like it was yesterday, and I was just a kid. And that was 20, 25 years ago, however long ago it was. And sometimes people, they want to fight for justice, which is good. I think we're going to talk about that some tonight. But sometimes we're too quick to make a post to say something. Sometimes we should be quick. And it's like we said, you can't watch that video, I don't think, and not go, that's wrong. That has to stop. We have to denounce what happened. But beyond that, many times, a lot of people want to just, especially with Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, they want to just jump on whatever's happening, and they don't even really know how to engage the issue. And that's probably why we're having this discussion tonight.
Well, yeah, and I think, and that's what I'm kind of bringing up, right? So after this happened, again, people protest, and there's a pretty good amount of people that were out in our cities, which I think highlights there's some tension, there's some anger, there's some hurt, and I think that's fair to say, right? It's bringing up, at least there's a clash in our society, in our culture, where at least one group feels as though they're being singled out, marginalized. Would that be fair to say, from all this stuff that's happening? So, talking about that for a second, growing up, again, I'm a white guy, grew up white guy. I don't know what it means. I never grew up as a black guy. I don't know what that felt like. And so I can't put myself and say, I know exactly what it was like growing up in that person's shoes. I don't. And so I think as Christians, there does need to be a response from us as Christians that says, how do we fully understand what somebody else has gone through in their life? What type of experience have they dealt with in their life? And realize that obviously it's hitting some nerve, right? Fair to say?
Absolutely.
So just kind of starting there, it seems as though there is definitely a nerve that's been hit.
Oh, it's been struck for sure.
Right? So what happened? People came out to protest. What were the protests about?
I think we were summarizing it. Basically, the end of this racial injustice of what we all specifically in the George Floyd case, like, hey, that has to stop. That cannot be how our society goes forward. And I believe that's kind of the center behind.
There's a feeling that
Yeah.
this is an ongoing issue that seems
Yeah, this
black
is
men
the
are
last-
being singled out
Yeah.
and
It wasn't the
being
first
killed
time. Right.
by those in power.
Because even in the last 3 months, multiple situations of black men who were murdered. And this, I think George Floyd just kind of triggered just an eruption of deep-seated felt emotion of just anger and hurt. And,
Yeah. And so I think tonight, just we clarify where we're coming from. I don't think we're here to say politically, this is what camp we fall under.
not at all.
I don't think it's to evaluate all that's happening in culture and look at, okay, are black men being singled out? We're not looking at those statistics tonight. But I think as Christians, how do we evaluate cultural angst that's happening and anxiety? How do we respond to it? And then how do we press forward and deal with those types of things? So one, I think recognizing, we just talked about, we should empathize with people that feel marginalized. I think Jesus would have said yes to that. He empathized with people all the time that felt marginalized in society. He goes and meets the Samaritans, and the Samaritans are the ones the Jews didn't talk to.
Define that a little bit. I know what you mean by empathize, but what do you mean when you say empathize?
When I say empathize, kind of talking about that idea
Yeah.
about earlier, that we should be quick to listen and slow to speak.
Yeah.
Where we're ready for a response. And I think we live in a society and the social media world that we live in, we're quick to respond, but we're slow to listen.
And I think that's the empathy is a big part of what we're talking about, and the first step to that is to listen. You can't empathize with somebody, or you can't do it rightly if you're not listening to how they're feeling. And I saw a video today or yesterday, and it was a group of white Black Lives Matter protesters. A black lady was trying to engage them, to tell them how she was feeling, maybe correct some of the things they were doing, and they wouldn't listen to her. They were yelling and screaming at her as if she were on the other side of the coin. And so the very group that's trying to stand up for the marginalized group is not even listening to the group who needs to be stood up for. And you can't empathize with somebody if you're not listening to what they're going through and what the problems are and the feelings that they have. And I think you're right. I think too many times we're really quick to go, well, let's just get together and let's tell that group of people what others should do for them or about them or to them. And it's the whole control thing. We think we have the answers, but if you're not part of that group, how can you have the answers if you don't even know what those people are going through?
Right. So I think step one, empathize, listen. We need to hear the other issues and hear people out and understand where they're coming from.
And two, I think throughout history, this is nothing new. It's new in our context, but groups across history have been dealt with. I mean, you mentioned specifically the Samaritans and the Jews and the clash that they had. I mean, since the beginning of time, there's been groups that haven't liked each other, have had some kind of tension or whatever, and most of it stems from baggage from things that have happened. I mean, if you think about what we're going through right now, even though the things that happened in America, in our mind, were many, many, many moons ago, it doesn't take away from the fact that it still happened. And so, even though there was the civil rights movement in the late 60s and other things that have happened to see some progress, there's still that deep-seated hurt, and it's always going to be like that, I think, because you can't just erase history. You can't just delete history. As much as some people have tried, it's always there. And so many times we see a little bit of progress, and then we think, okay, well, we're all good. It's all peaches and cream, it's all roses, but those things are still there, and they're still deep down inside a lot of people's minds, and so we have to remember that as well.
All right, let's get a little bit more of a hot button one. So I've seen this posted a few times, quite different, and on both sides of the issue here. And what it comes across is, if you care about this issue, you should post something about this issue. You should say something about this issue. You should speak up about this issue. Now I hear the heart in that. What do you guys think about that specific statement?
One thing I can guarantee you I will never do, there's a Facebook post that says, if I love Jesus, I have to share this. If whatever,
With an
that
OBE
you don't love God, if you don't share this post, the one thing I guarantee you is I won't be sharing that post.
You don't love
And maybe
Jesus.
that's just stubbornness on my part. But
Well,
So is there validity to that? Is there no validity to that? What do you think? Just in addressing
Well,
that
I-
actual issue.
I don't think there's any validity in saying that if you don't share this, that you don't care.
yeah,
I don't think what your Facebook status has is an accurate indicator
Yeah.
of your degree of righteousness or empathy or anything else, for that matter, by what's on your Facebook wall. In the reality, it costs very little to hit share. It costs nothing to hit share and put something on your Facebook wall, even something that's highly controversial. But back to what you said at the beginning, this is an area which I haven't seen any disagreement.
right.
You know, everybody's sharing. I haven't seen anybody going, well, that's not true. And there's largely, I think, I wouldn't say universal because there's idiots everywhere. But it's pretty close to universal agreement that what happened to
It's been a while since you called me an idiot.
what happened to him was awful. It was awful and never should have happened.
Yeah, I agree with Tim. I don't think there's any validity to, if you don't change your profile pic, or if you don't post this, then you don't care, you're not involved. I will say, however, now this may not be the right motivation, but I do think people, because of the way we're wired, it does sometimes create a movement that wouldn't be created otherwise. And I give a prime example of this. A couple years ago, there was this guy who was a total swindler. He tried to create this music festival out in the Bahamas, and there's a couple of documentaries on it, one on Netflix and one on Hulu. But he was going to create this big music festival. Long story short, he got it way in over his head, but he was able to promote the event and build it up to something just by getting a few really influential people on Instagram to post. It was literally like an orange box. That's all it was. Mm-hmm. But after about 2 or 3 really famous people posted it, everybody else started posting it. And all of a sudden, everybody's Instagram feed was this same orange box. And all it said, I think, was #fire or Fire Festival or something. And it caught on really quickly. Now, I say that to say, I do think that social media can sometimes help to promote, for lack of a better term, something that needs to be promoted or brought out or whatever. I mean, that was proof in that documentary that the mob mentality or the group mentality that people have, just even if it's just because they want to fit in, which is why I said at the beginning it may not be the right motivation, but even if it's just because people want to fit in, it can create a movement of something. Now, the question is, whatever movement you're creating, does it actually do anything? And I think that's really the question that we have when we're asking about changing your profile pic, posting something on social media. I think there's probably some good to it, but again, you gotta be, especially during the COVID pandemic when everybody's on their phone all the time, everybody's wasting time scrolling through Facebook, you gotta be hiding under a rock literally to not know what's going on. But even still, I think there could be some positive to it, but at the same time, there's also the other end of the spectrum, which is, well, everybody's just posting it because they don't want to be singled out as we don't care. So then they're going to post it. But what does that really do?
I find interesting in it, and to me, posts also depends on the tone with which people are posting, and so this is a lot of the tone that I've seen I don't care what you think, I'm going to say this. I'm like, well, actually, you do care what I think. And even towards the point of the movement, right? If you're wanting to enact change, we do care. We want you to see the need for change.
Well, you do care, you wouldn't post it.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think, and I use the word interesting, I'm able to walk away from it and not really have an emotion, or I can put my phone down and like, okay, I don't need to read anymore. But I think the trick here in all this is it's stirring up maybe other things that aren't necessary, that's kind of sometimes pulling away from the attention of what we're hoping to create a movement on, even by the tone with which, like, a thing that's interesting here in Utah specifically, Ogden, is we have also unfortunately experienced some other issues where we had an officer that was killed a week ago, and someone that my wife knew in another place was posting about that, trying to connect it to the George Floyd situation. And they had nothing to do with each other. You know, I don't care. And my wife's like, well, actually, those are two different things completely. They're not even connected in any way in terms of how that happened and those kind of things. And so I would caution anyone with Facebook too, is that, one, here's my rule of thumb, if that's not how I would talk to you in person, I try not to talk that way there as well. Like if I wouldn't walk up to you and be like, I don't really care what you think, because that's not who I am anyway.
Well, nobody would say that stuff to each other face to face.
Right, yeah.
You get behind a keyboard and a computer monitor, and all of a sudden, all types of kindness go out the window.
Yeah.
And compassion and listening and all the things we're encouraging Christians to do, we take away. The other thing I think you said was really interesting is, what are we moving towards? I think that's a question nobody wants to ask. But in any type of change that needs to happen in culture and society, if it needs to happen, what changes need to happen?
Sure.
What direction do we need to go in? If that's not crystal clear, then what we'll have is a movement that could get a life of its own, and it can go a totally different direction. You know, I think, and again, I know we're not trying to get too much into politics here, but there was a previous case, it was Ahmaud Arbery, and in that situation, nothing was brought to light. The guys who had actually killed him, they weren't brought to justice. They were friends with the DA and some other people in the town until the video came out. And then all of a sudden everybody's like, oh no, this is not right. In that situation, justice had not been met. And we're like, man, justice needs to be met here. That is a righteous cause.
For sure.
You know, that is a thing that says we see injustice that is not right. Justice needs to be met, and justice then is taken as a result of that. That's a good thing.
Absolutely.
I think if we're not careful as Christians, we can get sucked into the Facebook vortex, the social media vortex, and we have a desire to be part of something with no understanding of where it's headed, and I think that's a danger.
For sure.
And because of that, we're not compelled to speak to something that we don't fully understand, which is why listening should be our default status quo, number one response. You don't have to respond. In fact, the Bible says, be quick to listen and slow to speak. It doesn't say be quick to speak and slow to listen. So I think as Christians, we don't listen to the world's philosophy when it comes to this stuff. We don't have to have the first response out there. But we do need to be the first ones to listen to what's going on. If we turn off our ears and turn off our minds and we decide not to listen, that's unloving and unkind and uncaring. That is wrong. But I don't think that means that we have to respond. I also think in that it also doesn't mean that we shouldn't respond.
Right.
There are some things that maybe it would be good for us to respond to in culture because we have people around who want to know, what does a Christian think about this issue? And so, I mean, I think there's a balance there for sure, but I think it doesn't mean we have to be sucked into that.
Right.
Yeah, and I think, talking about listening, talking about being slow to speak, and it's very easy. I think this is part of the problem, is that it's very easy for those of us who aren't necessarily around what's going on immediately to, and I think this is the big question, to not take action or not say anything, but at the same time not really do anything. It's like, well, it doesn't really affect me. So am I doing anything wrong by not saying anything? And we kind of cower back and we retreat because we might know in our heads this is an injustice or this is wrong, or but it doesn't affect our day-to-day lives necessarily like it does other people. And so it's really easy for us, especially where we live, here in Utah, where most everybody looks like us. I mean, let's just be honest.
It's put the most homogenous state in the
The
country.
statistics.
Yeah.
And it's easier for us because we don't live in a place where there's a higher percentage of minorities or black people or whatever. It's easy for us to just kind of sit back and go, man, that's terrible. But then that's all we do. And I don't think that's right either. I don't think that's enough either. It's hard to know, what can I do to not speak out of turn, which I think there are groups who, in my opinion, are speaking out of turn because they're not listening to the real problem. They're not listening to the people who are being marginalized. But at the same time, how do I show love, Christ's love? How do I help to bring justice where I can? I think we all would agree that man's justice always falls short. God's justice is the only perfect justice, and maybe we'll touch on that in a minute. But still, what can I do to help bring justice? And that's a really hard question to answer sometimes. And sometimes we get so frozen over that question that we just don't do anything. And it leads to inaction, which isn't necessarily right either. And that's, I think, why we're having this discussion, because it's a very difficult thing to process and to think about and know what to actually do.
Well, let's talk about the justice thing for a second, because I think that's a really key point to this conversation. We have this word thrown around a lot, justice, injustice. Those words are tossed around in culture. They're used a lot. We get those from Scripture. Scripture has a clear sense of justice. What I think is fascinating about this whole conversation, you see what happened to George Floyd, and I don't think, like we said, I don't think anyone agrees or disagrees that that was unjust. Everybody looks at that and goes, that was unjust. Now, just for a second, we pause and we go, why is it that we all think that was unjust? We're so many different people. Maybe because there's an objective justice, that God is objective, and there's an objective morality, the law He's put on every one of our hearts. When we see something like that, inherently, we know that it is wrong. But then what happens with the world is they go, well, we know this is wrong. God put this on my heart. They may not admit that, or may not acknowledge that, or not realize that. But then they respond to that injustice by trying to bring justice. So I think with all the protests going on, you have probably two different groups. You have those who go, this is unjust. I want to stand up and voice my opinion. No violence is happening from them. They just want to share that with the public around them. And I want to make sure we distinguish between both of those groups. And then you have those who are looting. You have those who are targeting police officers. A police officer in St. Louis, I think last night, was killed. I think there were several in Las Vegas that were shot at. Cities all across America, there have been people, individuals, who have targeted those in authority, like police. We can look at that, though, and say that is also wrong. That is also unjust. Because just as George Floyd was made in the image of God, so are those same police officers. And so we realize that targeting these people, one side or the other, because of a feeling of correcting justice, is also wrong, because we make terrible judges. And I think one of the biggest things with this whole justice argument is that we want justice, but we really don't want justice. Justice for all of us, all of humanity, is we're all guilty, because we're all terrible judges. What we need is grace. And the grace of Jesus Christ is the only thing that a lost and dying and broken world outside needs. It's the only thing that's going to save him. It's the only thing that's going to cure man's plight. And it's the only thing that's going to transform this unjust, broken world outside. So with injustice, talking about some of this, the nature of who we are to be as Christians of grace, What does it look like for Christians to display grace to others around? Because we don't want to display justice. We want to display grace.
I think one thing that would help is if everybody, and this is really, really hard to do, grace is a lot harder than justice.
Yep.
A lot of times.
Significantly.
Justice is easy, grace is difficult. And this is difficult in every area of our life, because where I think we go wrong a lot of times is when there's any kind of conflict or there's any kind of tension or something like this goes wrong, our immediate reaction is to think the worst of whoever's on the other side. We just you get in a fight with your wife, you're mad, at least people, I've never had one, but people who've been in fights with their wives tell me that this is what it's like. I've been told, you get in a fight with your wife and you're mad and you just assume the absolute worst intention from them on everything. They're just doing it to spite you and they're a jerk and whatever. Every kind of conflict we get in, we tend to do that. We project the worst intentions onto the other person, when the reality is the vast majority of the time they don't have those intentions at all. And we're all upset and we're so hurt, but we're projecting on something them that they never even meant in the first place. And I think about that with some of like the rioting, like what we saw in Salt Lake even. Man, people are so angry if you watch some of those videos of them flipping and burning that police car. But they're flipping and burning the police car of an officer who in all likelihood agrees with everything that they say they're angry about.
Right.
You know?
Right.
But they're projecting what the one officer did in Minneapolis onto every police officer, you know, just kind of blanket projecting those same kind of intentions on which is not fair, because that's not the intention of the vast majority of police officers. I would say the overwhelming majority of police officers. And you have the tendency to do the same thing on the other side towards the rioters without, like we've talked about, listening to them or trying to understand or whatever. If you frown on that, we just kind of look at that and make blanket statements that aren't really true. So back to the grace part, I guess all of that, in all of that, in showing other people grace, sometimes the hardest part is that first step of trying to see them, you know, to see, like some of those writers are just so mad, they're so angry. But the first step in some of that is to just look at them and see behind all of that, a lot of them, I don't think they even know what they're mad about. They're just need to be angry at something. And maybe it's Corona and racism and everything else that's all balled up into one, and it's just boiled over, and now I'm just ticked. And they would have a hard time even articulating why they're ticked. But grace is not seeing that and getting mad. Grace is trying to look at that and see broken and see hurt and see that the ultimate, what they're angry about in all of that is their need for grace and their need for a Savior, in trying to see that in them. And that's really hard to do in any kind of conflict, I think.
I think we all, you said earlier, you know, we're all broken. Justice feels our fleshly need. Grace is so hard because it doesn't feel the way justice feels, right? When you're on the playground and the bully gets what he deserves, you feel vindicated and right. And so we want that justice because it feeds that flesh in us of seeing in ourselves, and sometimes waiting for God's justice. We don't seem to think is fair because it doesn't seem to happen when we'd like it to happen, and so it leaves us empty. Grace is so much harder because it's giving of yourself in that, like, hey, no, this is really what you need, even though, in any situation, we all would agree what we saw in that video angered us. I was angry. I know you all were. We are with, like you said, everyone's in agreement. I want justice. However, in any scenario, like the writing or whatever, grace is harder, but it's more valuable, and it goes farther to restoring what we are hoping to restore than justice will. Now, the beautiful thing in that, justice will happen. It's just not going to be on my terms.
So what does the difference in man's justice look like and the grace of the follower of Christ look like?
Well, I think government is good in its most basic sense because it is a picture. It's supposed to be a picture of justice. I think, we talk about the American experiment. We talk about our system and the way that it has been put together, and it's, we're really proud of how we do government in some ways. There are things we don't like about it, obviously, but our system of government is very different from the vast majority of the rest of the world. And so part of that, I think, is government is good and that it can help display what justice is. The problem is it's still run by sinful man.
Not only sinful, but we also don't know everything.
Right.
So you never can know the full story of a whole story, right? If someone tells you come before a judge, and they're like, "Hey, this is what happened," the judge's job is kind of discern the truth. Mm-hmm. So he's trying to figure it out, but he's limited in his information because you may have one guy over here who's really good at telling his story. This guy's really bad at telling his story. This guy had a lot of money to pay for a good lawyer. This guy didn't have any money, so he's got a public defender, like in My Cousin Vinny, who's just terrible. And so in that case, the judge is trying to figure out what's really going on.
Which is, I think, what I'm saying, that's where man's justice is limited. I mean, and that's part of the problem. Just looking through history, I think a lot of people would say that people who are white typically get off for a crime that a black person wouldn't. Not necessarily, although this is sometimes the case, not necessarily because the judge or the jury is racist or is, favoring one over the other, but sometimes it's just the fact that a white person can pay for a better lawyer and a black person can't. And that sounds really terrible, but that's
at the very least the perception.
That's at least the perception. And so I think that has a lot to do with what we're talking about today too. Is it's not just, a white man killed another black man. There's a whole history of people of color or minorities not getting a fair shake, if you will. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. Again, that's part of why I'm saying man's justice isn't perfect, and it's not even close to being perfect, because you're always going to have things like that. I mean, we know of people who, you can watch a court case and go, that guy or girl or whoever, they did it. But because they have a really, really good lawyer that knows how to spin things or find a loophole in a law, or they're at least able to talk down, a deal to a lesser charge or whatever, and sometimes they go off scot-free. And everybody in the room knows they're guilty, but they can't prove it, or there's some loophole. And so that's why it's just difficult, because we have a justice system that, if it were perfect, would be great. But it's not perfect because it's run by sinful men and people who don't know everything, to your point.
I think the hard part of that grace angle with the justice is, Paul made clear in Romans that the powers that be are appointed by God, which is an amazing statement. And you think about who the powers were when Paul made it. It was Nero and Caligula and some pretty horrible, horrible people. And Paul said God put them there when they were not, Christians under the hand of Nero. And he probably wrote that before Nero came to power. But under Nero, Christians weren't getting a lot of justice. And yet God said, I put them there. Because, to go back to Bobby's point, because justice is ultimately in God's hands. I think the hard part in situations like this, when we look at it and think about it in terms of the officer that killed Floyd, is without a doubt the most hated man in the United States of America right now. And there's a sense in which our desire, like Nick was saying, we want to see the bully get his due. We want to see justice done. It's not a bad thing that we want him. He should go to jail. He should get the punishment, the full punishment of the law for the crimes that he did. But that's the easy part. It's easy to go, he should get whatever the max penalty is. The hard part is to look at that officer and your heart break for him and go, he should get justice, but man, I hope he finds Jesus in all of this, and want for his, and sincerely desire for his heart to be made right with God somehow through all of this. That's a whole lot harder to do.
So I think taking that point, right, now there's different, people are obviously upset about different things in this whole case. People upset at the looters, people upset are the people who are committing violence in the streets, people upset are over police officers and what they deem to be abuse of power. So what I hear you saying, Tim, and I agree with you, is that we as people of grace, the first response we should have is to pray for those people. Pray for the people who may be the most hated in society. Because we, as well, were once children of wrath. And we were going to face that wrath one day. But Jesus saved our lives as enemies of his throne and redeemed us and brought us into his family. And we should also have the same heart. Praying for someone who's very much a hated person is a hard thing to do. And I think in that, we still pray for justice. It's not as though we don't want justice to take place or we want to live in an unjust society or an unjust world. We do want that, and we should speak up for things that are unjust. But I think you're right. At the same time, we also need to make sure that we're people of grace. That needs to be what the world around us hears, is that we're people who love like Jesus loved, who listen like Jesus listened, who come to the marginalized in society and go, Jesus loves you. He died for you. He died for your sins. And if you repent and believe in him, you also can be saved. That type of thinking will change the world. And I think the weapon that we have, the weapon of the gospel, seems like it's not a weapon at all because it's a message in which we do nothing and Jesus has already done everything. So it's like, wait a second, that's not enough. People have said this when they talk about Christians, well, praying's not enough. Sharing that message is not enough. We tried that before, it's not worked. So we're going to do it our way now. We're going to take justice into our own hands.
So, good.
No, you bet.
I think to that point too, it's important as followers of Jesus Christ, we cannot wait to bestow that grace and pray and focus that only when these moments happen. It can't be a reactionary viewpoint. It's got to be who we are always for our community and for people who are suffering, and for those that are like that. It should be a constant thing. What I think the concern oftentimes is we only see it rise up as a need at this moment, or what happened is for years, and there are people who are offering grace all the time, that is a thing, but for a lot of us, we don't think about that idea until it's apparent in front of us. We don't think about the need to pray for grace and forgiveness until we hit a situation that triggers it, and that doesn't change necessarily the culture of the brokenness of man. However, that is how we change a culture and a people group that we live in, is by making that a pattern of who we are always, not only in these moments when, and I'm just as guilty as that of these are when it kind of pushes you to the forefront of thinking of it, but we have to be thinking in that way consistently of people that hurt us or we see hurt happening, of being people of grace and forgiveness and enacting that on a consistent basis.
Did you guys read the Richard Dawkins article about talking about Christianity? I know me and Daniel talked about this before. Richard Dawkins, famous atheist, he wrote this article. Now again, Richard Dawkins does not believe in God. He's written books against God and against specifically Christianity. He made an article that said the decline of Christianity throughout the world has actually been bad for the world. Because every time Christianity would come into a new culture, a new land, the marginalized people in society would be given a better status. The treatment of women would be given a better status. And a lot of other religions around the world, when they expand and they grow, the marginalized get a worse place in society. The status of women gets a worse place in society. But when Christianity comes into a society, the status of people changes. Why? Because we believe we were all created in the image of God. Whether you're Jew or Greek, slave or free, we're all created in the image of God. There's no classes in Christianity. We're all brothers and sisters in Christ. And I think it's really telling that an atheist guy can at least connect the outward benefit of what Christianity should do. And we think about that from a standpoint of all this is connected to a belief in God. Not just a belief in God, but that God actually exists and is present and has a plan in redeeming this broken world. Christianity is the only answer for it. The hope of Jesus is the only answer. It's not platitudes that we're given. This is the answer. There is no other answer. We should cry out for injustice. We should cry out for brokenness and point them out and say that's evil and that's wrong and that's wicked. Absolutely. But if you want to change the world, love Jesus and tell other people about him.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to make that distinction when we talk about that too. It's not institutional Christianity that will do that. It's not going to church on Sunday Christianity that will do that. It's radical grace that will do that. And I think sometimes after we've hit a certain comfort zone, I've been guilty of this for sure, we forget how radical grace is and how much grace we've been given and how life-altering that is. You know, back to our Facebook thing, it just dawned on me a minute ago to talk about if you want to, you know, do a Facebook post that's really controversial. I don't have enough guts to do this one. But if you want to do a Facebook post that's really controversial, but I think shows the heart behind the radicalness of God's grace. What was the name of, I can't remember the name of the officer in Minnesota.
Derek something.
Derek. If you want to do a radical Facebook post, you know, if you love Jesus, pray for the salvation of Officer Derek or something like that, you know. That would get some reaction or something like that, I think. Because it would be hard to do that and mean it. I mean, if I'm being honest. But that's grace. And it's the same grace that's been given to us. And we tend to go, well, he doesn't deserve it. You know, I don't want to pray for him. I wouldn't want to go share Jesus with him because he doesn't deserve it. Or whoever it is that, you know, we don't think deserves it. But somehow we did deserve it. And the reality is we don't deserve it any more than him or anybody else. Now, if we could live out that kind of radical grace, that's the radical grace that changes the world.
No, that's a good point. And kind of changing gears just slightly, practically speaking. So we talked about listening well, being quick to listen, not being quick to speak, being people of grace, sharing the message of the gospel, letting that grace transform us and transform others. But we still have, I think, right now in society, just being honest, I think there's a couple of groups that society is looking at in harsh tones. It's probably police officers on one hand. On the other hand, you see the rioters and the protesters in the streets, and people are falling into camps. You know, I'm for this group, I'm not for this group, I'm for this group, I'm not for this group. How do we, as Bible-believing Christians, love people well and do what is commanded of us as Christians practically in the middle of that kind of tension and divide?
I think so. One, in practice, if we're carrying out this idea, right, if we're going to listen and observe, both of those groups need to be heard then. So we have some dear friends that are officers who are heartbroken and burdened and just as angry, like we said earlier, as what's happened. And they are just as terrified because they're not desiring these kind of things. And then we have those that are rioting and maybe not even just that protesting, let's maybe put it in that context, who are broken or just wanting to be heard. Now it's carrying on. I think coming back to one, how do we love people when we don't agree with them? That's a good question. There are a lot of people on the planet I don't agree with. for all kinds of reasons. It doesn't even, it could be you're a Packers fan, whatever it is. No disrespect to Packers fans.
Cowboys, man.
Yeah, that's right. But like that, how do we love people still and be on the other side of an issue with them? Because I think we're called to that, specifically as believers, of saying, listen, you and I are not on the same page in this, but I desire for you the same thing that God did for me. And so there's that grace, and that forgiveness doesn't come because someone deserves forgiveness. Because if that was the case, we wouldn't have received it either.
Nobody would receive forgiveness.
Yeah. So it's kind of like we teach our children. You don't forgive someone because they've asked for it. You forgive someone because that's what, one, God has called for you, and it's best for your heart, right? Because when you sit there with all that angst, it only destroys you, right? But learning how to, we've seen this before, if someone who's murdered a family member, only to have the family members that are still alive come and forgive them for that action. It's the most powerful image of what God can do in a situation. It doesn't mean consequences don't exist still, because they're always going to be. I think it's important for us, one of the things for me and my wife, careful how we speak in our home about these things, the words we use to describe the people that are out there. My kids, your kids, they absorb everything, and then it carries on to them as they grow up, because you can hear children say things, they didn't come up with that worldview on their own. They got it from whatever they were absorbed, whether it's social media or their home or their families. So one step for me, and I'll just leave it at this and let you guys chime into that, is being very cautious about how I shape my kids in seeing these situations, to not hate one group over another, but to look at them in the lens of what Christ has called us to look at them. Like, okay, they deserve our grace and our care and our love. They deserve it as well. We want accountability, but man, we got to learn to forgive.
Well, and I think in both groups here, they're police officers. We have friends who go on the streets every night, and they protect and serve, and they want to live out their Christian faith, right, as a police officer. And their families are praying for their safety every single night. And when stuff like this happens, putting yourself in someone else's shoes, just put yourself in their shoes. That is not an easy thing to do. In the same sense, put yourself in the shoes of George Floyd's family and what they must be feeling and the tragic loss they've gone through right now. That is not an easy thing to do. So as followers of Christ, we have to understand that we're not called here to take a political side or be in a camp, or I'm Republican or I'm a Democrat and I'm gonna post all my social media articles that fit my view, and I'm gonna post mine that fit my view. That's not our kingdom. Our kingdom is the kingdom of heaven, and we don't belong to this mess that's out here on the earth. So don't entangle ourselves, as Paul says to Timothy, in civilian pursuits. That is not our aim. So if we're not to entangle ourselves in that, by listening and loving and being people of grace and going, you know what, I'm going to pray for those police officers. We're going to try to be blessings to those police officers. We're going to hope that God protects them and keeps them safe and brings them home every night to their families. And in the same hand, we're going to pray against racial injustice. If there's abuse of power that is happening in the hands of, if it's police or city officials or whoever, we're going to pray against that. We're going to pray that God's justice would be made known and clear, and that we could live in a world that is just. Those are all things that we should do, instead of putting ourselves into a camp. I think that's one of the biggest things I take from this, is that we don't belong to the mess out here. We belong to a better kingdom.
And I think we take the kingdom to the mess. I think one of our biggest, difficulties, I'm sure, for me, for sure, that, in terms of practical things we can do, I think one, we have to all be real careful to check our own anger, which can be really hard to do. First Peter says we should always be ready to give an answer to anybody who asks for the hope that we have in Jesus, but to always do so with gentleness and respect. And it's the gentleness and respect part that we tend to lose first, even if we're right in the point we're making sometimes. But I think too, it's hard for a lot of us to relate, because we have lives that are so comfortable we don't have any contact anywhere in our life with anybody who's marginalized. We're not doing anything for the poor, the orphan, the widow, the disenfranchised, anything, in any area where we're touching anybody's lives that would fall into any of those categories. And, you know, that's how we make a difference. We are part of another kingdom, but we're taking that kingdom to all of those other people. And we need to have somewhere in our life, you know, where we're intentionally trying to make inroads in those areas. And it's just easy to get caught up doing your thing, living your comfortable life in your comfortable church, in your comfortable home, going to your comfortable job. And we have the best intentions in the world, but most of us aren't doing anything in those areas. We give a can of green beans to the poor at Thanksgiving and go, ooh, I feel so good about myself. But we're not really investing our life in those areas. And I think that should be something that's, issues like this challenges us and convicts us.
Yeah, I think the word intentionality and what you were saying, I was thinking of the word, you know, being proactive. I think that's really key. And whether it's with our kids, people at work, you know, whether it's racism, sexism, which the Me Too thing seems like it's long history now. You know, that was the big one last year or the year before. But many times these kinds of things happen because nobody is proactive and intentional about standing up against it. So you hear a joke and you know it's wrong, but you don't say anything. Or you hear somebody say something that, even if it's bordering on, you know, racist or sexist or whatever, and you just go, oh, that's just Joe Schmo, that's just how he is. Like, we have to be people that stand up for truth and say, hey, that's not right, don't say that, you know. But too many times we kind of just, because we don't want to not be cool or whatever, we let it kind of slide. And so we have to be proactive in those situations. And then again, with our kids, be very careful what we say, how we say it. It's funny, people could say, when I was growing up, you can't say that in church. And I always thought, that's the oddest statement, because if you shouldn't say it in church, you probably shouldn't say it at all. And so it's not just that we don't say things around our kids or around family or whoever, it's that we try not to even think those types of things, because if it's not right in one place, it's probably not right in the other. But being proactive to speak out against, because again, the more you allow it, the more it kind of takes shape and more people give into it, because it's our sinful nature. So again, just being intentional, proactive about standing up against those things, whether it's just speech or actions too. The hardest part is just outside of that, knowing how to engage with the actual issue.
I would say litmus test too, let's talk about a church and a community. Specifically, how do you know, a pastor friend told me this, how do you know your church is having any effect of any kind? If you go to the closest business near the church and ask them what they know about the church, if they don't know you're there, that probably says and speaks a lot into the way you engage your community. Now, you could take that in a lot of different directions, in either way. But I would hope, as redemption, the way we engage our people to even listen and hear, they would notice if we weren't here. Now, we have a long way to go to make that happen, where we wouldn't even claim that we've succeeded and accomplished that goal. But not so much in just action, like car washes and things like that, but more in, are we engaging with the people we live with? Are we hearing their hearts, what's happening? Would you know in your community what the biggest issues are? Would you know what your homeless population is? Would you know most of us would say we don't have a clue. We would take guesses at it, and I see some over here, or how many orphans are in your community? Honestly, and I would be guilty of this as well, a lot of us wouldn't even have answers to those questions. And on the proactive side, like that's a litmus test that would be like, do people notice that you, not so much so that you can feel better about knowing you did good work, but the more active you are, someone would notice if you were not there. In that regard, I would hate for Lord to call us home in life not miss a beat because we did nothing for the kingdom. You know, that we were so stagnant in our faith that it was just,
And I think with that too, that to individualize it, that I think it's important that all of us as individual believers, you don't have enough time or energy to pour all of your heart into every cause.
right.
You just can't, it's not possible for one human to do it. But that you look at the world and you look at the needs in our community, right where you are, and you look and go, God, what are you calling me to do in those areas?
I mean, just simply put, like for an issue like this, you know, we said, are we praying for our police officers? Are we praying for those who are putting themselves on the line every single day? That's a really simple thing to do. The same hand, you know, maybe you don't understand why people are protesting. Go talk to somebody. Ask them. Listen to them. Sit down with them over a cup of coffee. And, you know, maybe get a chance to listen to them. Maybe get a chance to hear where they're coming from and get to share with them. Take where they're sharing with you about how they feel and the injustice that they're feeling. And talk about the justice of God. Talk about the grace of God. It's a chance to share the gospel with somebody. So I think there is some, to your point, Tim, we are not going to handle, you look at around the world and go, there's all this happening in every city across the world, man, or across America. I can't change that, but there is things that we can do individually. And they may seem small, but if the people of God act like the people of God, and we all do our small part in that picture,
Exactly.
the world's going to see the difference. And so we're not here to follow your political party and follow the party line. We're people of Christ. We belong to the kingdom of heaven. We respond to his kingdom. We live for him. We work for him. And if you find yourself, I think another litmus test, if you find yourself always quoting your political line, you're probably not following the kingdom of heaven. So I think we need to cut that junk out and go, man, let's be people of Jesus. You know, he's our King, he's our Lord, and do what he commands us to do. Well, I think we've got probably hit about all the time we can on that one. But if you have questions for next week probably won't be as heavy, at least this way, maybe more theologically again, because we're possibly going to hit some issues related to God and time.
Yeah, in fact, I talked to our possible special guest today, and more than likely he's going to join us all the way from New Orleans, Louisiana. So, a little teaser there. Going to have a special guest on, and he's actually a PhD student in that very topic, how God relates to time and how that deals with heaven and where we go when we leave this place. So it could be really interesting.
We were confused as we were talking about it this past Monday, so we decided to go with this issue instead for tonight. But next week should be very good. And if you do have questions throughout the week, please text them to redemption at 94,000. Send us a message, send us an email. Maybe you still have questions about what we talked about tonight. Maybe it's more of an individual conversation we can have. We can talk about that too. So we thank you for tuning in tonight, and we'll see you next